Today at Speedy's Garage, we're replacing the front brakes on a 2010 Hyundai Genesis Coupe with the track pack on it. To get this done, we're going to need a flashlight, a digital caliper, torque wrench, 21mm socket. I'm going to use an electric impact, some brake parts cleaner, brake fluid, hammer and a punch, an 11mm wrench. You may need a C-clamp, and obviously you're going to need some brakes. I decided to use the EBC red stuff on this car since it's performance oriented. One thing I was a little bit disappointed with is that they did not include any anti-squeal grease in the box with the brake pads, so keep that in mind if you order these. And then there's the actual brake pads themselves. They say that they have a coating on these that helps brake in. I don't know if that's worth anything or not. I've never actually used these pads before, so I was anxious to try them out. And the part number you'll need for the 2010 Hyundai Genesis Coupe with the track edition Brembo Brakes is DP32147C. That's for the front. You're also going to need a jack and a jack stand, some type of container to catch any brake fluid or brake parts cleaner. I'm going to use a stool to make things more comfortable to work with. And you're going to need a 1/4 inch inside diameter vinyl tube for bleeding the brakes. A lot of modern performance cars don't have an actual frame on which you can place your jack. Instead, they have a welded in brace that's designed for something that's slotted. So I got a hockey puck and put some slots in it so that I could use my 2-ton jack for cars that have that setup. And here you can see what I mean. On this Hyundai Genesis, this is on the front. You can see that ridge that's designed for the jack, and then the hockey puck will slide over that to give you a jack point. You can also use the factory jack to get this done, or you could even take a piece of wood and slot it to get it done as well. The idea is to go up over this ridge and go flush against the steel where it's welded in. The factory jack will work, but obviously you always want to use a jack stand for safety as well. So step one is obviously to jack up the car. You'll notice I use the jack stand on the support beam underneath the car as an additional safety. You never want to work on a car with it just on a jack. It's way too dangerous. So basically this is a partnership between the jack and the jack stand. I raised it up enough so the jack stand could slide underneath the support, and then I lowered the jack so that some of the weight is already on the jack stand and the jack is really just there as a secondary. On these Brembo brakes, the brake pads actually come out of the back of the caliper. They're very easy to work on, but I went ahead and turned the front wheels before I jacked the car up to give me some easier access to the brake pads. Next, we just want to remove the wheel. Okay, now you can see how the Brembo calipers are set up. You got 2 retaining pins and a retaining spring that are on the back side of the caliper. Take some tension off of this spring and use a punch and a hammer to gently tap the retaining pins out, and then you'll have to back the pads off a little bit because the pistons are in the caliper are pushing on them, so you have to back those off some. I'll show you how to do that in a minute. And then your old pads will literally just slide right out. Now, first thing I'm going to do is take off these bleed screw caps and put them in a safe place, because these things have a tendency to disappear as you're working on the brakes, never to be found again. I'm going to start by spraying just a little bit of brake cleaner around these pins to hopefully make them a little bit easier to remove. And I'm going to use the punch, and like I said, it doesn't take very much. You want to be very careful of your brakes. They've got a nice powder coat finish on them. You don't want to hurt that. And once you get the retainer out of the caliper, push down your spring and it'll slide right out, and then the spring will come out, and you can do the bottom one. Easy peasy. Okay, the next thing you want to check before you just decide to put new brake pads in is check the condition of your rotor. All brake rotors have a minimum thickness designation, and it's usually stamped on the rotor somewhere. And I hope you can see that. This particular one is 26 millimeters. It says Min TH 26 millimeters. So now we got to measure to make sure we're in that range. Now we're going to use our dial caliper to measure the thickness of the rotor to make sure we're within spec. I've set this one to millimeter and I've zeroed it out. And now we're just going to place it over the rotor and take a measurement. You want to make sure the tool is perpendicular to the rotor. And there you can see we're at about 28.4 millimeters, so we're well within the spec. Now I usually like to take two measurements to make sure. So I'm going to turn the rotor 180 degrees. I'm going to take another measurement. .1. So that's well within spec. So now we can just swap the pads on this particular vehicle. So as you can see, as the brake pads wear, the pistons exit the caliper. And the brake pads are under tension by those pistons. So they're not just going to come out. And you don't want them to anyway. What you want to do is you're going to put your 11 millimeter wrench on the bleed screw. And on these Brembo brakes, you've got one on each side. So you're going to have to do them independently. Most normal non-performance brakes will just have one bleeder. Brembo puts them at the top very logically because air rises, and that's how you want to get the bubbles out. Now you're going to hook up your clear vinyl tube and have it run down into your catch pan. And I always put a rag over it to hold it in place so it doesn't pop out and start spraying fluid all over my floor. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to break tension on the bleeder screw, and doing it here will literally allow me to grab this by hand and just squeeze it to push these back, and then I can tighten that bleeder screw again. Now I'm sure there's going to be some internet armchair quarterback that tells me, oh, you don't have to do this, you can just push the pads back and let the brake fluid push all the way back through the car and into the master cylinder. Well, I don't like doing it that way. Number one, you're pushing dirty fluid back through your brake system, and number two, it's about 10 times the effort versus just cracking this bleed screw right here and pushing the pad back. Now, if you end up in a situation where you're working on an older car or something of that nature and these pistons are frozen for some reason, that's where you use that C-clamp that I showed you earlier. You obviously want to put a wood block or something on the front side of the caliper, and then you place your C-clamp over the caliper and you can slowly tighten it, and it will pull this brake pad back, giving you access to remove it. There I've opened the bleeder. Grab the pad and pull back on it till you feel it seat against the caliper and tighten it back. And if you're very careful and don't let any bubbles or air trickle back into the caliper, it'll be much easier to bleed when you're finished. Just complete that same process on both sides, and then the brake pads will just wiggle out nice and easy. And as you can see, these are pretty well worn. You've got a chirper on the pad, on one pad on each side, and what happens is as the brake material wears down, this little piece of metal starts to contact the rotor and it starts to chirp, and that's how you know when your brake pads are worn out, time to replace them. You want to hang on to these shims. These are anti-squeal shims. Hang on to those because those will go on your new pads. The next thing I like to do, although not required, I like to clean up everything when I'm working on it so that it's like new. So I'm going to clean up the caliper and all of the parts with brake cleaner. It doesn't take too much time, but it just makes me feel better about the work, knowing everything's going back together clean. I also like to hit the rotor with some brake cleaner just to clean it up good. It doesn't take much. I'll do front and back. And then I don't touch it at all after that. Okay, now that we've got all the parts cleaned up, spring, pins, backing plates, we're ready to prepare the pads to go back in the car. I've put just a very light coat of the anti anti-squeal grease on the anti-squeal shim. And once you do this, start messing with this grease, be very careful and do not touch the front of your brake pad surface. Only touch it from the sides. And then you just reinstall the anti-squeal shim. Say that 3 times fast. And it just snaps onto the pad like that. And then I'm going to go ahead and put just a couple of dabs of grease right where the pistons contact the shim, just as a little extra insurance. Some people don't use this. I like to, just because it's less work to try to come back later and make it stop squeaking. If you do this up front, you know you've done everything you can. And now that one's ready to go back in the car. Okay, now that you got the brake pads ready to go in the car, it's real simple. Just put them back in the opposite as you took them out. You make sure, obviously, that the holes line up with the pinholes. Next, you want to slide the bottom pin into the caliper. Make sure it passes through both brake pads. And then use your hammer and your punch on the back side to seat it. Be very careful. You don't want to nick your nice painted caliper. Now you want to put your spring in and pay attention that the extruded part goes against the pads, so it hooks underneath the bottom pin, and then the idea is it's going to put tension on those pads. Now you want to put your top pin in. And again, make sure that it passes through both pads. And before you start beating on it, make sure it lines up with the hole in the caliper. Now let's cross-check everything, make sure it all looks like it's lining up. Give the rotor a spin to make sure everything feels even. And now we can bleed the brakes. Before you start bleeding the brakes, always check to make sure your fluid reservoir has plenty of fluid in it. The last thing you want to do is let that thing go dry. Major problems if that happens. There's a couple of different ways you can bleed brakes. You can use compressed air and a special tool to provide pressure in the master cylinder and force air out of the bleeder screws. Usually those are set up to be around 15 psi of air pressure. There's a special tank that you can get that you basically air up. It looks like one of those bug spray tanks. It has various adapters that hook onto the master cylinder, and it's the same principle. It puts air through the system or into the system as pressure, and when you crack these bleeder screws, it lets the fluid flow out. Today I'm having my lovely wife assist, and she's basically just gonna push on the brake pedal while I crack this bleeder screw. Since we were really careful when we were getting the pads out and didn't let any air go back into the caliper, this is just a precautionary measure. I always like to do this just to be absolutely sure there's no air in the system, but it won't take much since we didn't replace the whole caliper or really open the system up for very long. All right, you ready? Tension on the pedal. Push. Let me know when it gets to the floor. It's there? So that's all there is to it on that one. We're going to do that same procedure on the bleeder screw on the back side. And then the brakes are bled when you don't get any bubbles as that fluid travels through the line. And I didn't get a single bubble, so I know they're good to go. Brake fluid will eat paint, so the last thing I do is around the bleeder screws, I go ahead and hit it with a little bit more brake cleaner just to make double sure I'm not going to have any problems. I also like to come back and just double check the bleeder screws to make sure they're nice and snug. You don't want to over tighten them because you can strip the threads, but just check them to make sure they're snug. And then don't forget to put your dust caps back on to keep crap out of your bleeder screws. Remove your jack stand and then lower the car and set your torque wrench to 80 foot-pounds and tighten your lug nuts. Do them in a star pattern. And I always like to go over them one more time just to confirm it, so I didn't miss any. The last thing you want to do is top up your brake fluid reservoir. Always clean it before you open it. The last thing you want is some contamination to get in that fluid and mess up your brake system. So make sure it's good and clean. And I like this Valvoline .4 brake fluid, synthetic. It's cheap. You can get it at a local auto parts store. And again, be careful with the brake fluid because it does eat paint. And just fill it up till it hits the max line in the reservoir or close to it. Don't go over. Now that we got the brakes installed, we need to take the car for a test drive, and emphasis on test. Make sure you're in a controlled area where there's not any traffic to ensure there is absolutely no issues with the brake system before you get out somewhere where there's other cars and traffic and people. Well, the test drive went great. I can tell the EBC red stuff pads are going to bite a little bit harder than the original pads that were on this vehicle. There is a coating on them, as I mentioned before, and EBC says it takes a couple of 100 miles for that to wear off and that it helps with the bed-in of the brakes to the rotor. This car had no shakes or shimmies under braking, and then I measured the rotors to ensure that they were still the proper thickness, and so there was no need to upgrade the rotors on this particular vehicle. However, if you're getting any vibrations under braking, you need to at least have the rotors resurfaced, if not replaced, before putting new pads on the car. EBC's paperwork says to drive the car in urban areas for about 1,000 miles and then go out and do 5 stops from 60 mile an hour down to 20 mile an hour, 5 in a row to kind of finish up the bed-in procedure. For a performance car, I'd probably go that route and go ahead and do that, but for a daily driver car like this is, we're probably not going to recommend doing that after the fact. The brakes feel pretty good. Once that coating wears off of the pads and they bed in through that procedure with the rotor, I think they'll be good to go. If you want to see more maintenance and how-to information, visit my website, www.speedysgarage.net.